Historic Frankfort, Inc. is a local history group that puts on, among other things, a lecture series in the spring and the fall. And this is our third lecture of the spring. Tonight, Nicky Hughes is going to talk about Frankfort and the Civil War. But before we turn it over to Nicky, I'd like to make a few, say a few sort of related things. But if any of you aren't, but would like to become members of Historic Frankfort and help support our history and preservation efforts, the dues are pretty reasonable, $10 for an individual membership and $15 for family membership. And we have some membership applications which we'll also leave up here on the table. And if you have an interest in becoming a member of Historic Frankfort, I hope you'll come up and sign up. Also in the fall, Richard Taylor is going to talk to us about the Kentucky River Palisades. And he has asked if any of you here in the audience tonight or any of you watching this on Cable 10, if you have photographs or things that relate to the Kentucky River that he could incorporate into his slideshow, he would really appreciate you making those available. And Richard can be reached at Poor Richard's Bookstore, or I guess you could call him at home at 223-5775. He's looking for pictures that relate to the Kentucky River to turn into slides to use in his slideshow. Also, for those of you that have an interest in Frankfort history and haven't seen this book, it's Capital on the Kentucky, and it's a book that Historic Frankfort published in 1986, and it's a 200-year history of Frankfort and Franklin County. And it has a very good chapter in here on the Civil War. It has an interesting map of the way that Frankfort looked prior to the Civil War, and also, you probably can't see it very well, but I'll leave this up here for you to look at it after Nicky's talk. Also, an 1860 watercolor by S.I.M. Major of the way that Frankfort looked in 1860, right at the eve of the Civil War. You probably all know about the project up on Fort Hill, but Fort Hill isn't the only Civil War-related thing that happened in Frankfort. As a matter of fact, I guess I think that Frankfort probably has more Civil War-related history than probably any other city in the state. And tonight, Nicky's talked to us in the past about what happened up on Fort Hill. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about Frankfort during the Civil War. So with that, we'll turn it over to Nicky.
Got to disrupt John's nicely arranged little exhibit. Last Saturday, I went down to the Great American Brass Band Festival and played a, were you there? Yes, it sure did. It rained just a touch, and we played a full concert and then did a parade in driving rain. And then sat around the rest of the day in wet, woolly uniforms. And amazingly enough, guess what happened as a result of that, more or less? Pretty savage cold. And then I've been on the road for the last 3 days, all of which is one way of saying I may not be at my very best this evening. But when John Gray calls and says, come give a speech about the Civil War, by golly, unless I have to be pushed in feet first, I'm going to go do it. And the reason for that is that anybody in this town or anybody in this state that is really interested in the Civil War and our local part of it is very much indebted to Mr. John Gray and to Historic Frankfort for the leadership in the Fort Hill project, because without that, where we are now, we never would have gotten to. Thank you, John. So I'm here and I'll snuffle right on through this. We also have been the last 3 days at Biltmore in North Carolina, and I see lots of heads going, oh yeah, that's cool. And, if you haven't been there and you're interested in historic homes, do go, if for no other reason, so that you can stand up in front of a bunch of people and say you've been to the biggest house in the United States. And it certainly is that. It is conspicuous consumption writ very large. This was the Vanderbilt's home at the turn of the century. But we won't deal too much with the Vanderbilts tonight. We'll get a little bit closer to home. We'll get a lot closer to home. We'll get to Frankfort as what happened here in the course of the Civil War. We don't usually think of Frankfort as a battleground, or do we? Maybe we do. But usually the battles that take place here in Frankfort are political ones rather than ones in which actual bullets are propelled back and forth. And indeed, during the course of the Civil War, that was most of the kinds of battles that took place in this town. In that sense, Frankfort was very much its normal self during the Civil War, in that most of the battles were political ones. And some very important political battles were fought here, and for the most part, those were fought at the old state capitol. And it seems like as I go through my career, I keep going from one of these Civil War related sites to the other, and it seems like I'm dragging the Civil War around town with me, and or maybe it's the other way around, I'm not sure. But I want to talk about lots of these sites around town that were involved in the Civil War. One reason for doing that is to point out, as John was saying, how many Civil War related sites there are. And I think that is a resource for Frankfort that can be developed. We do want to put together a Civil War interest tour of Frankfort. And as we go through this program tonight, I think you'll see there are lots of places here that do tie into the war. Particularly once we have the Fort Hill project complete, I think that's the next step for us to take. But we'll look at the political battles that were fought first to begin. When the United States came apart in 1860 and 1861, the Great Secession Crisis, Kentucky was quite literally caught in the middle between the two warring factions, North and South. It took a long time for Kentucky as a state, as a government, to decide what to do. Everyone realized that the outcome of this decision was going to be critical. Abraham Lincoln said, "I think to lose Kentucky is the same as to lose the whole game." A New York newspaper editor wrote, "Lincoln would like to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky." And that wasn't too much of an exaggeration of the importance that people put on which way Kentucky was going to go. The South wanted Kentucky for lots of reasons, not the least of which was our northern boundary, which would have made a superb northern boundary for the Confederacy, that being the Ohio River. In the middle of the 19th century, it was darn difficult to get an army across a river of that size, and there weren't many bridges at that time. Both sides wanted the natural resources we had to offer. What's one thing we're known as well as anything for that's absolutely essential to fighting a war in the middle of the 19th century?
Whiskey.
Not whiskey, but that's good. It doesn't hurt. Although I suppose some people might say it does hurt a little bit. But horses. We had horses then. Soldiers needed horses even more. And of course, an even more important resource that we had was people. Everybody wanted the hundreds of thousands of warm-bodied young Kentuckians who could be put into uniforms and fight on their side. Another part of the strategy involved was rivers again. Not only was the Ohio an important protective barrier, could have been for the Confederacy, but the rivers that flow through Kentucky go right into the heartland of the Confederacy. The Cumberland River and the Tennessee rivers out west in particular go all the way down into northern Alabama and Mississippi, all the way through middle Tennessee. And that would turn out to be very, very critical as the war went on. Kentuckians themselves, it was hard for us to decide what to do, or for them to decide what to do, because there were connections to both North and South. Economic, social, political, personal, family, they pulled very much both ways. The average Kentuckian on the street, the average citizen that you walked out here on the street and talked to on the sidewalks in Frankfort in 1860 and 1861 had an attitude about what was going on that we find, I think, a little bit contradictory, but it made absolutely perfect sense to them then. Your typical Kentuckian was in favor of the Union and of keeping Kentucky in it. That was certainly the majority opinion. Kentuckians had a huge investment in blood, toil, tears, and sweat in the Union. Kentuckians had made tremendous contributions militarily and politically and in leadership and in every other way to the development of the United States. And a lot of people didn't want to see that end. They also knew that trade with the North was a pretty lucrative thing to do as well. But the other side of the coin, and this is what sounds peculiar to us, he was pro-Union, but that typical Kentuckian was also pro-slavery. He was absolutely convinced that the proper place in society for the black man was as a slave. And he was absolutely convinced that slavery was essential for the prosperous economy of the state. It was difficult for a Kentuckian at that point to imagine how this place would be run without people in servitude. So you have an attitude that is sort of alien to the way we think about the Civil War. People who are in favor of the Union, also in favor of slavery. Now, of course, there was an entire range of opinion. People who were adamantly opposed to being in the Union wanted to secede at the first opportunity, and there were even a few Kentuckians who wanted to abolish slavery, but those were certainly the extremes. There were many attempts to make compromise between the two sides, and a Frankfort citizen was very important in that effort, that of course being John Jordan Crittenden, who was in a sense the successor as the compromiser after Henry Clay, who had done so much to postpone the Civil War for many decades. Crittenden made several attempts to find a way around a battle, a military solution to the problem, but one of the great tragedies in American history is that he was not successful in that endeavor. So it meant that Kentucky did have to make a decision in which way we were going to go. As I said, that took a while. And guess what it boiled down to? Boiled down to a political battle between, guess who? The governor and the legislature. See, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is the most critical decision ever to be made in the nation's and the state's history, and it's a battle between the governor and the legislature. The governor was Beriah Magoffin, who can safely be said was pro-Southern in his sympathies. He called a special session of the legislature, which met in January of 1861, and refused to secede from the Union. The best that the pro-Southern faction could get passed was a resolution that condemned the use of force to coerce states that had seceded from the Union back into the Union. They stayed in session to April, passed lots of resolutions, argued, screamed, and hollered a lot, but weren't able to pass a secession resolution. Magoffin, as it became obvious that there was going to be a civil war between North and South, like every other state governor, receives a telegram from the War Department in Washington saying, here's your quota for soldiers from your state, volunteers, to fight on the side of the Union. Magoffin sends a snippy little telegram back saying Kentucky will provide no soldiers for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states. That one gets quoted a lot. The one that doesn't get quoted quite so much is the one he had to send a week later to Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, saying we can't send you anybody either, after the Confederates asked for a regiment of men to fight for the Confederacy. Well, getting ahead of myself a bit. In May, there was another special session, and they came up with a uniquely Kentucky approach to this situation. This is an absolutely vital decision that has to be made. What are we going to do? postpone making that decision. How are we going to do it? We're going to find a third route. We're not going to go north, we're not going to go south, we're going to declare our neutrality. The legislature and the governor agreed that Kentucky would take the middle course. They would side with neither the North or the South. The Kentucky State Guard would be ordered to repel the soldiers of either the North or the South if they entered the borders, if they crossed the borders of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Where a year previously there had been one nation with one government in Washington, D.C., now in the summer of 1861 there were three nations in effect and three governments, one in Washington City over the United States, one in Richmond over the Confederate States, and the one here in Frankfort over the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It gave everybody a little breathing time. And everybody, north and south, for quite a while, went along with this, because nobody wanted to offend us Kentuckians. Everyone was afraid, all right, they've done this strange thing, they've declared their neutrality. If we push them, they might go over the edge to the other side. So both north and south, well, they let us get away with it for the rest of that summer. Another Frankfort resident, not a native, but a frequent person passed through here in the 19th century, comes into play at this point at another site. Simon Bolivar Buckner. He's now the commander of the Kentucky State Guard, which is the state's volunteer militia force. And things are really hopping up at the state arsenal at this point. General Buckner has been reforming the militia. He has organized a pretty well-established, well-equipped, well-armed, well-uniformed little army for the state of Kentucky that's replaced the enrolled militia, the people that when you reached a certain age you had to go to the courthouse and sign your name, and you were a member of the militia and you were subject to being called up. That hadn't been working too well, so they went to this new system and gave Buckner the job of organizing this, which he did very efficiently. And up at the arsenal, among other things, he established an ammunition factory, which began churning out cartridges for this new state army for the state of Kentucky. And at one point they had 32 I think, women who worked long hours every day making ammunition, which in the Civil War period, for the kind of weapons they were making them for, were just paper cylinders with gunpowder and the lead, projectile lead bullet in them. These were cased up and sent up to a powder magazine that was at the corner of the cemetery closest to the arsenal. And that was the storage for General Buckner's supplies. As it turned out, over these months when Kentucky was being neutral officially as a state, individual Kentuckians were making their own decisions which way to go, north or south. And it turns out that most of General Buckner's Kentucky State Guard ultimately decided to go south and join the Confederate Army. Sometimes entire companies from some communities went away. Some of them went north and joined the Union, but the majority of them did go south. These individual decisions affected every young man in Kentucky, and out in Franklin County, 440 young men chose to wear one uniform or the other. 253 more or less joined the Union Army, and about 190 joined the Confederate Army. These kind of figures come as a surprise to Kentuckians nowadays. We've developed for ourselves since the Civil War the image of a southern state, but it wasn't necessarily so in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War. As in the course of the entire war, and there are different ways of counting and different numbers you can come up with, but about 100,000 Kentuckians fought in the Union Army and about 40,000 in the Confederate Army. So it was over 2 to 1, Union versus Confederate. From Franklin County, most of the ones that went to the Confederate Army went to the 9th Kentucky Cavalry Regiment, the 2nd and 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiments, and the 4th Kentucky Infantry Regiment. And this brings me to another site that I now have an association with. I now have an office up at Berry Hill. And the gentleman who lived on that estate at that time was a Judge Thomas Monroe. And when the war came along, he joined the Confederate Army and became a major in the 4th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment. But sadly for him, his service in the Confederate Army was not very long because he was shot and died at the Battle of Shiloh. On the Union Army side, most of the Franklin County young men went into either the 3rd or 9th Kentucky Cavalry Regiments or the 22nd Kentucky Infantry Regiment. Now, the 22nd Kentucky Infantry Regiment was commanded by a Frankfort citizen named Daniel W. Lindsay. Now, that's the Lindsay of the Vest Lindsay House. And I see all the nodding heads, and we've all been reading the papers, and I'm here tonight to assure you that the status of the Vest Lindsay House is not going to change. All right, we'll press on back to the Civil War. Lindsay eventually got to be the Inspector General, the head of the Kentucky State Guard, the pro-Union Kentucky State Guard that was organized as the war progressed. During that summer of 1861, the great electoral process was churned up to decide who would serve in the legislature and how the legislature would vote and who would represent Kentucky in Congress and how those people would vote on these issues. It was done as it was done in those days. There was a reception for the Unionists held at the Capitol Hotel across the street from where we are now. The guest was a very famous Kentuckian, the biggest hero, the biggest draw they could pull in at the time, General Robert Anderson, who was a Kentuckian and had commanded the garrison at Fort Sumter and was the first great hero of the Union cause for his refusal to surrender and his gallant defense of Fort Sumter. There was a barbecue. Well, there were several barbecues. There was a particularly huge one apparently at Julian's Woods on the Louisville Road. This worked for the Union cause. In the elections at the end of the summer, 9 out of 10 of Kentucky's congressional seats went to pro-Union men. In the Kentucky House of Representatives, 77 of the 100 seats went to Unionists. In the Senate, 27 of the 38 seats went to Union men. So what are the Confederates going to do? They're sort of skunked here in Frankfort. Go somewhere else. They held a pro-secession convention down in Russellville, Kentucky, where I grew up. And it was very much a rump session. Everybody knew that Kentucky state government was here in Frankfort, but they had representatives from a lot of Kentucky's counties, met in Russellville, declared that Kentucky had seceded from the Union, petitioned Jefferson Davis for a place in the Confederacy, which was granted, and Kentucky then had a star in both flags. They passed a constitution, declared Bowling Green to be the new Confederate capital of Kentucky, and fortunately in that new constitution made provision for the Confederate government to operate on the road, to be mobile. And that is indeed where it was for the remainder of the war, for its influence could only be felt where there were Confederate soldiers. And it spent the rest of the war, someone once said, quote, in a Sibley tent next to the general's headquarters, unquote. They followed the Army of the Tennessee. In fact, there were some points in the war where the only Kentuckians voting for representatives in the Confederate Congress in Richmond were the soldiers in the Army of the Tennessee. At the end of the summer of 1861, the neutrality policy collapsed. It fell apart. The Union began recruiting soldiers over at Camp Dick Robinson within the borders of Kentucky. The Confederates insisted that that was a violation of neutrality, so if the Union fellows were going to violate it a little bit, they were going to violate it big time, and they occupied Columbus out on the Mississippi River, which they thought was the best place from which to defend the Mississippi River. There was a brief season of active campaigning which went all the Union's way, and the Confederates who had occupied southern Kentucky around their capital at Bowling Green and Columbus and a line across southern Kentucky were forced to withdraw. This left the pro-secession, the pro-southern folks in Kentucky in a very tenuous situation. And in the most tenuous situation possibly was the governor of Kentucky, the real one, the one here in Frankfort, Governor Beriah Magoffin, because he now sat in opposition to a very, very strongly pro-union legislature. His demise finally came late in 1862, but it took a long time to get there. Late in 1861, the legislature passed a bill that urged the withdrawal of all Union troops from Kentucky. Magoffin vetoed it. The legislature promptly overrode his veto. The legislature passed a bill saying that anyone who was serving the Confederacy had forfeited their Kentucky citizenship. Magoffin vetoed it. The legislature overrode the veto. They took away responsibility after responsibility from Governor Magoffin, and by August of 1862, it was clear that he really had very little power left. It then became a question of how does he honorably get out of town and go back to Harrodsburg. The problem was that the lieutenant governor, Lynn Boyd, was dead and couldn't succeed him. The Speaker of the Senate, who would have been the next man in line, was John Fisk. He was very much a pro-union individual. This did not suit well with Governor Magoffin. He was not willing to resign and allow that individual to take the governor's chair. So what do you think they did? They came up with a deal. Here's how it worked. The Senate Speaker, Mr. Fisk, resigned his office as Speaker. They then the legislature elected as Speaker Mr. James Robinson, who was considerably more pro-Southern in his outlook than Mr. Fisk had been. Governor Magoffin resigned. Mr. Robinson, the newly elected Senate Speaker, was sworn in as the governor of Kentucky. And the legislature then promptly re-elected Mr. Fisk as its Speaker, and Mr. Magoffin got on the coach, went to Harrodsburg, and everybody went on their merry way with a new, slightly more satisfactory governor, and the old problem child, Beriah Magoffin, out of the picture. One of the things that had been done to weaken the authority of the governor was operating of the state's military forces through something called the State Military Board, which was a panel of gentlemen that really administered the troops raised in Kentucky. And their headquarters is another site that's still with us, the house on Miro Street that's the YMCA office. They operated out of there. And we still have most of their records in the Military History Museum up at the Arsenal. And believe me, these gentlemen were bureaucrats in the finest sense. They churned out tons and tons of paper, and fortunately that's been saved and to give us a very good account of how the government went about arming the Union Army soldiers from Kentucky early in the Civil War. Well, maybe Magoffin should have hung on just a little bit longer, because late in August of 1862, guess who comes back? Confederate Army. They make their grand attempt to retake Kentucky. John Hunt Morgan, the great cavalry leader from Lexington, whom, if you are pro-Confederate, is fondly referred to as the the thunderbolt of the Confederacy. If you are pro-Union, you are more likely to refer to him as that horse thief. He makes one of his raids into Kentucky, goes back, tells Confederate General Braxton Bragg, you go to Kentucky and every man jack in Kentucky will flock to the Union Army and you'll raise more soldiers and you know what to do with. Kentucky will be on the side of the Confederacy. Bragg says, okay, I'm going to do it. By the way, Braxton Bragg was probably the most unpopular general in the Civil War on either side, certainly among Kentuckians. There were several Kentucky officers who, had they had half a chance, would have relieved the Union Army of its duty to shoot Braxton Bragg. They did not get along, particularly John Cabell Breckinridge and Bragg went at each other tooth and nail for the duration of the war, or whenever they were around each other. Two armies came into Kentucky. The first, under Confederate General Kirby Smith, came around the Cumberland Gap into eastern Kentucky, basically up I-75, came up that way this afternoon, as a matter of fact. Soundly defeated the Union Army sent to stop them at Richmond, Kentucky. One of my favorite characters in the Civil War was involved in this. General William Bull Nelson was the Union Army commander. General Nelson had been an officer in the United States Navy and he had the vocabulary to prove it, and he used it very often. At the climactic moment in the Battle of Richmond, his army has fallen back and fallen back and fallen back because he wasn't there to organize things. He rides up on his horse, and Bull Nelson is a 300-pound soldier, which was quite a large individual in the time of the Civil War. There were those larger. And he's trying to organize his troops and form them into line. It's working pretty well. And he yells out, boys, if they can't hit me, they sure can't hurt you. Boom, smack, on the ground, shot him. It didn't kill him, but it killed his army. And it was probably the worst defeat suffered by a field army on the Union side in the course of the whole war. General Nelson, I'm getting way away from Frankfort, but hey, Russ is smiling, so it must be amusing. General Nelson went on to Louisville, where he met his fate. He was shot during an argument in the Galt House by Jefferson Davis. You're thinking, what is Jefferson Davis, the Confederate President of the Confederate States of America, doing shooting a Union Army general in the Galt House in Louisville? It was another Jefferson Davis, Jefferson C. Davis. It created some confusion at the time, too, when word got around that Jefferson Davis had shot a Union Army general. And anyhow, this had immediate repercussions for Frankfort. Frankfort had been the Union Army, or the Union, pro-Union state government's capital. Suddenly it ceased to be that, because the Union troops that retreated from Richmond, retreated through Lexington, retreated through here, went all the way to Louisville. That was the end of the defense of central Kentucky. Kirby Smith's troops were here within days. They rode into town. Colonel Scott's 1st Louisiana Cavalry Regiment led the way, rode onto the grounds of the old state capitol, and ran their flag up over the building. By the way, we've found that flag now. It still exists. It's in a museum in Newmarket, Virginia, and we've had a copy made of it, and you may see it in strange places as time goes by. The Confederates received a fairly enthusiastic greeting here in Frankfort, because there were still a great deal of citizens of Frankfort who were in favor of the Union, regardless of what state government was in favor of the Confederacy, regardless of what state government was doing. There were economic repercussions for Frankfort, because armies did what armies tend to do, and that is get what they need. You know what this is? This is jeans cloth. This is reproduction of the way jeans looked in the Civil War. About all that's left now is the term jeans, which refers to the kind of trousers a lot of people wear. But there was a factory here that made that stuff, and that's what a lot of Confederate Army uniforms were made out of. The Frankfort Woolen Company, and that's a cotton and wool mix. And it was the cheapest form of clothing textile, and had traditionally been the clothing that was used for slaves. And ironically, it's what turned out to be the predominant uniform in the Confederate Army. Well, the Frankfort Woolen Company just happened to have in stock in the summer of 1862 74,960 yards of this stuff. And the Confederates decided it's going to be turned into uniforms. Well, the Woolen Company had hoped to get about $1.50 a yard for it. That was the going rate. Well, they got paid $1 a yard. That's not such a great loss, is it? In Confederate money. And Confederate money wasn't worth a whole lot in the summer of 1862, and it got to be worth a whole lot less real soon. The Confederates brought that Confederate state government finally gets to Frankfort, and they are going to install their governor, Benjamin Hawes. The first governor, Confederate governor, had been killed at the Battle of Shiloh, by the way, along with Major Monroe. He had already been sworn in, so it really wasn't an inaugural, but they had a very elaborate installation ceremony with artillery salutes on the grounds of the State House, and all the Confederate high muckety-mucks, the big shots, Braxton Bragg even, was here. And they planned to have a great inaugural ball that evening in the Capitol Hotel. But there were uninvited guests. Gentlemen arrived wearing blue suits. Coming in Louisville Road were troops of General Sill's division of the United States Army. General Bragg, as he was wont to do, decided that this really wasn't the best place to fight a battle, so he would evacuate the city of Frankfort. The inaugural ball was called off. Frankfort had a little near miss here. The Confederates decided that they were going to destroy the bridge over the Kentucky River, not the Singing Bridge, where the covered bridge where the Singing Bridge is now, the covered bridge that Paul Sawyer would later paint. Well, Paul almost didn't get a chance. But the city fathers went to the Confederate engineers and says, please don't burn this bridge. In the first place, it'll really disrupt traffic around Frankfort. And in the second place, it's real hot, it's real dry, and if you set fire to this thing in the middle of this town, it's going to burn this whole town down. The way the war was being fought in the summer of 1862, it was still possible for the Confederates to say, all right, we'll go along with that, we'll be gentlemanly about it, but tell you what you got to do, you got to tear the floorboard out of it. Okay, we'll do it. Citizenry went out, pried up the floorboards, threw them in the Kentucky River. It floated away. The Confederates evacuated town, General Bragg and his staff, and the Confederate government, going back into exile, leaving town by way of the railroad tunnel that runs under the state arsenal, rode out on horseback. Of course, the Union Army was equipped with superb engineers who had the bridge over the Kentucky River back up and functioning in a matter of hours, and the Union Army was soon hot on the trail of the Confederates heading eastward and ultimately to the Battle of Perryville, which would decide the outcome of the war in Kentucky, really. There was one skirmish fought in the course of this action, and it took place on the property that we now know as Berry Hill. The Union troops, as they were leaving, left their sick and walking wounded and folks who just couldn't make it here under the command of a young lieutenant, John J. Roberts, who was a local citizen of Frankfort who was home on leave. Colonel Scott, that Louisiana cavalry fellow we talked about earlier, circled back around, just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see what's still in Frankfort, you know? And sure enough, there wasn't much. Lieutenant Roberts, though, was pretty persuasive, pretty clever fellow. He built himself what was called a Quaker gun. That is a stovepipe on a pair of wagon wheels, put it behind the stone fence that ran by the Louisville Turnpike, and convinced the Confederates that he had quite a force with him. The ruse didn't last permanently, however, and the Confederate cavalry made an assault, and probably the news was going to be real bad for Lieutenant Roberts and his sickly little garrison, but the cavalry literally rode over the hill to the rescue. A Union Army cavalry regiment arrived from Louisville, coming in Louisville Road, took up the fight, and they skirmished their way back down into almost to the bridge again when they broke off and the Confederates rode away. The federal authorities decided that that occupation of Frankfort in 1862 had been much, much, much too easy. They said, we've got to do better if this ever happens again. How do you defend this town? You build yourself a fort. And that's what they proceeded to do. They built Fort Boone, which is one of the two forts that are on Fort Hill, naming it, of course, after Daniel Boone, the great Kentucky hero. A succession of garrison troops passed through Frankfort, camping in various locations. At Berry Hill, some at the old Capitol. There was a barracks out on the Owenton Road. And of course, a lot of them camped up on Fort Hill in the vicinity of Fort Boone. One of the regiments that we got pretty good records on was the 2nd Maryland Volunteer Infantry Regiment. You wonder, what's a Maryland regiment doing here in garrison in Frankfort, Kentucky? Well, there was a New Hampshire regiment here too for a while. They had been attached to General Burnside's corps, which was brought west from the Army of the Potomac. And he fought in a campaign down to Knoxville, and to defend his supply lines he left regiments in garrison all through central Kentucky. And that's why we got these gentlemen from New England stationed here. The Marylanders seem to have gotten along rather well here in Frankfort for the most part. They were entertained by the community on several occasions. They provided the honor guard at Senator Crittenden's funeral parade as it passed through Frankfort. Two of their members, we know, several of them probably died of disease while they were here, but some of them met unnatural fates. One of the garrison's responsibility was to guard the railroad bridge. One of the 2nd Maryland soldiers was doing that one day, missed his footing, went into the Kentucky River and drowned. Another one, an officer named Stephen Gowdy, got involved in Frankfort civilian affairs, and I mean that quite literally. It seems that a young lady in Frankfort had been dishonored. A contingent of Frankfort citizens decided that they were going to pay a visit to the man, I dare not say gentleman, who had dishonored this lady, and they were going to take tar and feather and see that right was done to this individual. And this officer in the 2nd Maryland, Lieutenant Gowdy, went along with them. And it was a house somewhere over in the vicinity of Lieutenant Governor's Mansion and the penitentiary, I'm not exactly sure. But they stride up to the front porch to address the malefactor. And Lieutenant Gowdy suddenly discovers that the Frankfort citizens have lost their courage, and he's the only one standing here. And he's the only one to receive the gunshot that was the response through the door to the knock and the mob's approach to the house. And he was killed. There were lots of other regiments here. The 103rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment actually did most of the work building Fort Boone. The 6th New Hampshire and the 30th Wisconsin. There was a Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment. General Burnside, the famous and not particularly successful general, reviewed the troops at Fort Hill at one point. In 1864, Frankfort finally does again become an actual battlefield, and this was the really serious fight that took place here. On June the 10th, the Confederates cavalry, a detachment of John Hunt Morgan's troops, Morgan himself wasn't here, he'd sent them over from Georgetown, and he went on to Cynthiana, attacked Frankfort. The state government had a pretty good idea they were coming. Morgan himself had written that he intended to strike for Frankfort, and he wrote that to his commanding officer, "You will soon read of my men on the streets of Frankfort." And as word got around that Morgan was making another one of his raids, state government sprang into action. It left town. the state's papers and possessions were packed onto a train in front of the state capitol, and they took off for Louisville. Well, the Confederates had thought of that too, and they had a detachment of troops between here and Louisville who blocked the railroad, and when the train stopped, opened fire on it. And apparently there was a very dramatic scene, which would be great cinema. I wish somebody could do it sometime. Of the train goes into reverse, backs its way to Frankfort, with the guards exchanging shots with the Confederate cavalrymen all the way back. They ended up that evening back at the depot, which was then in the middle of what's now Broadway, and not too much the worse, but probably a little scared by the whole affair. The governor calls out the militia. There are at that point none of those Maryland soldiers, none of those New Hampshire soldiers, no soldiers except people on leave here in Frankfort. So the governor calls out the 36th Regiment of the Enrolled Militia. That's the clerks, the farmers, the bankers, the shopkeepers, the government workers, us folks. They take them up to the state arsenal, issue them muskets, and position them in various locations around, strategic locations around town to protect the city. Oh, they also called up the Peaks Mill Rangers, which was the local scouting detachment. And if you read the rosters of these people, it's as Russ says sometimes, it's like reading the modern-day Frankfort phone book. It's just amazing, the familiar names you do see there. The Confederates obligingly attack. They come up Old Owen, what we now know as Old Owenton Road, and make an assault on Fort Boone. The defenders open fire on them with those muskets they got out of the arsenal. And you know who was standing on the wall with a musket to his shoulder, banging away? The fellow who had called up the state militia, the governor, Thomas Bramlett, who was a fiery pro-Union man, despised Abraham Lincoln, and didn't get along with Abraham Lincoln at all. But it's the only time that the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky has been called upon to shoulder a musket and actually fight in the defense of his capital. Now, I'm sure there have been many governors who felt like they should have shouldered a musket and fought in the defense of the capital, but Mr. Bramlett was the only one who was actually required to do so. If you look at the maps we handed out, you can sort of trace what happens. The attack failed. The Confederates then rode off of Fort Hill during the night and in secret, went down across the Kentucky River at the lock and dam where Jim's Seafood is, probably stopped in and had the fisherman's platter. That's another free commercial for Jim's Seafood on Cable 10, by the way. And the next morning appeared in South Frankfort on the other side of Paul Sawyer's Bridge in force and demanded the surrender of the city. The city fathers twice refused surrender notes and finally said, don't send us any more surrender demands, we're not going to surrender this town. Shooting broke out back and forth across the Kentucky River. Right where we are would have been a fairly dangerous place to be on June the 11th, 1862. If you've ever wondered why Battle Alley is called Battle Alley, that's because that's where the Confederates were in the course of some of the fighting that took place in that day. There weren't a lot of casualties, and but it was apparently pretty dramatic, because lots of Frankfort citizens wrote about and recalled the artillery shells that flew over downtown, and they were fired from the cannons at Fort Boone and flew right over where we're standing now and crashed into South Frankfort. In fact, they crashed into some of the buildings and houses in South Frankfort. You remember these are the local militia, not necessarily too expert in the use of these artillery pieces, and they did hit some of the houses that they were there to defend. But nevertheless, they were successful. They repulsed that Confederate raid on Frankfort, and I think that is the critical, important thing that happened in this town as far as Frankfort's concerned in the history of the Civil War. And it's one of the most important days in the history of this town, because at the same time the citizens of Frankfort were successfully defending this town, the defenders of Cynthiana were failing. And a good portion of that town was put to the torch and burned. I have absolutely no doubt that if the Confederates had gotten past Fort Hill, if they had gotten across that bridge, if they had gotten across this river, and at one point they did send a detachment down through the cemetery, and the guns at Fort Hill were actually firing shells into the cemetery. If they had succeeded, I think they would have burned the old Capitol, they would have burned the office buildings and the other government buildings on the property with it, they would have burned the state arsenal, they would have burned the West Lindsay House. They would have burned the building where the YMCA has its headquarters now. They would have burned everything else in this town that the Union government and the Union Army had anything to do with. And you know what the state legislature would have done? They'd have moved to Louisville in a heartbeat. And that would have been the end of state government in Frankfort. Because time after time in the 19th century, every time one building burned, there was a movement in the legislature to move to Lexington, to move to Louisville. Under that circumstance, they'd have been out of here. So those gentlemen who Governor Bramlett called up and who successfully defended this town in June of 1864, I think are, if you're a loyal citizen of Frankfort, I think they're pretty important folks in the history of this town. And that's one thing that makes that site, the Fort Hill site, so important. The federal authorities came in after that, said that Fort Boone wasn't good enough. Oh, by the way, it's kind of dramatic, the state of technology in the Civil War period. The cannons that were at Fort Boone in June of 1864, their maximum range was the Department of Library and Archives building, which is a pretty darn good shot. And it sort of surprised me when we sat down and figured out what the range of those artillery pieces was. From up there, they could pretty much shoot what they could see. Well, they should have been able to. Like I say, these were the amateur, the B team, and they probably wouldn't actually hit anything at that range, but they could have lofted a shell out there if they'd wanted to. The federal authorities came in, built a new fort, a second one, on the actual summit, the very highest point of Fort Hill. It was never called anything but the New Redoubt. It was a much more formidable fort, though. Deeper ditch around it, higher walls. It was going to have 18 heavy artillery pieces instead of just the 2 heavies and 3 light guns that were in Fort Boone. And there's a little bit of irony about the New Redoubt, which gets us back to the peculiar situation in Kentucky during the Civil War, when they needed labor, cheap labor, to build that fort. Who'd they get? Cheapest labor around, slaves, because slavery was still perfectly legal and perfectly common in Kentucky, in Frankfort, in 1864. The Emancipation Proclamation hadn't freed a single slave in Kentucky. It only applied in states that were in a state of rebellion against the Union, which Kentucky wasn't. So it's sort of ironic that it's a Union Army fort built by slave labor. They simply confiscated slaves from local owners and set them to doing the project. The war never really came back to Frankfort as combat. It did to Franklin County, and that came in the form of guerrilla warfare in the last years of the war, when the war really turned nasty and Kentuckians turned against Kentuckians. Men with frequently little or no attachment to either side, many of them deserters from one side or the other, formed guerrilla bands, terrorized the state. The Union authorities blamed it all on the Confederates and took draconian measures to control this guerrilla menace. The state's military governor was General Burbridge, who became thoroughly despised by all concerned, particularly for his most infamous order, which he issued from here in Frankfort, General Order Number 59, which declared that for every pro-Union man killed by the guerrillas, 4 prisoners, pro-Confederate prisoners, would be executed. There were several raids in Frankfort, one at Steadsman's store, which we almost certainly know was led by a pro-Union deserter, one at Bridgeport, and finally one at Peake's Mill that killed one Robert Graham, who was a well-known pro-Union man. The Union authorities brought 4 men out of the military prison in Lexington here, Elijah Horton, Thomas Hunt, John Long, and Thornton Rafferty, and took them up into South Frankfort and shot them right on the spot. and literally carried out this most obnoxious of the Union's military government's rules. Burbridge was eventually dismissed in 1865 when he tried to disband the Kentucky militia. He tried to do more than he had the political clout to get away with, but his replacement, General Palmer, turned out to be not particularly better. By the end of the war, this kind of thing had completely changed your Kentuckian on the street, the Frankfort citizen that you'd go out here and meet, his outlook toward the war. Where at the beginning of the war, he had been very much in favor of the Union, odds are he was now very much opposed to the Union. Had Kentucky had the opportunity to realistically secede from the Union in 1864, 1865, I think they might have done it then. Some wags have said that Kentucky seceded once the war was safely lost. Because the Union authorities had treated Kentucky just as if it were in rebellion, even though in fact state government had remained loyal to the Union, and we had sent all those 100,000 men into the Union Army. Now, one thing that was absolutely intolerable to Kentuckians, our typical Kentuckian, was what the federal government did regarding slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything here, in part because they didn't want to irritate Kentuckians. But late in the war, when the need for manpower became so great, the Union authorities made slaves what had to be the best recruiting deal you could ever offer anybody. Young man, you leave the farm, you come join the army, and we're going to give you this nice blue wool suit, and we're going to give you $10 a month. White soldiers got 13, and we're going to give you your freedom. You're not a slave anymore. And thousands of young African American slaves left the farm, took that $10 a month, that wool suit, and their freedom. And that absolutely infuriated white Kentuckians. It was the unpardonable sin that the federal authorities committed, because you did two things. You destroyed capital. Lots of Kentuckians, their capital was their slave property. And you disrupted the economy. And you put the black man in the uniform of the United States Army, and you gave him a gun. This was the one thing that white Kentuckians, white Southerners, had always feared more than anything else. And now this is what the federal government had done as a matter of policy in order to save the Union. That was unforgivable. As a consequence, at the end of the war, the people who got the heroes' welcomes when all the soldiers came back, not so much the Union troops, but the Confederate troops. Who would win election from most parts of this state and sit down in the State House and in the governor's mansion for the rest of the 19th century and run the affairs of this state for the most part? Gentlemen who got to be known as the Bourbon Democrats. Gentlemen who had served the Confederacy, not the Union. Gentlemen who would, when the progressive movements of the 19th century came along, just said, well, I think we'll pass. And that had a good bit to do with what happened to Kentucky in the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The war was received here in Frankfort, nevertheless, with great celebration. Telegram came in the day after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia, and everyone knew that this was, in effect, the practical end of the war. It would be over soon. And they made some noise. The cannons at Fort Boone on Fort Hill fired off 300 blank shots. Answered shot for shot by cannons in the lawn of the state arsenal. Total of 600 shots were fired off that day in celebration, and I suppose they thought, well, we're not going to need this stuff anymore. Let's just burn it up and have some fun. And that's presumably what they did. The signs of the Civil War, physically, politically, emotionally, slowly, very slowly healed in Kentucky and in Frankfort. There are people in our lifetimes who have referred to the Confederate Army as the Democrat Army and the Union Army as the Republican Army. Until within the last 15, 20 years, you could trace voting patterns in Kentucky pretty much by what had been pro-Union and pro-Confederate areas of the state. And that's only now fading away. Here in Frankfort, they abandoned those forts up on Fort Hill very quickly. It became farmland again, and a jungle of cedar trees and vines and bushes and everything under the sun that would grow and flourish and on limestone soil here in Kentucky did so up there. And people pretty much forgot about what happened here in the Civil War. I've had people look me straight in the eye and say there is no fort on Fort Hill. Well, there are two, and no question about it. In 1966, the city of Frankfort acquired the Fort Hill property, and 30 years later, thanks to the efforts of John Gray and Historic Frankfort, began a project that will open that as a historic site, interpreted and educational, and a reminder of what the people who fought here on both sides were fighting for in the course of the Civil War. And see how I cleverly started off thanking Historic Frankfort and brought it full circle right back, and I'm done. The fort is due to open next May. Come see it. Thank you much.
Said about, in the minds of many people, there was a war between the Republicans and the Democrats. I was impressed when three of the people chronologically closest to the Civil War in my family and Eileen's, later in their old age, volunteered that, you know, the war was between the Republicans and the Democrats. Mm-hmm. Yep. And the Democrats lost.
Yep. And it went right on up. I didn't really talk about it, but the State Guard that Buckner formed, and most of them went south, they formed a new organization called the Home Guard, which was the pro-Union local militia. And they really got a horrible reputation for helping implement that unionist government of Kentucky that was so oppressive. And Ed Pritchard's son, Nathan, told me the story in his family, and this is folks my age. He recalled his mother referring to people as their family had been in the Home Guard, and this was not a compliment. And that's up into the 1950s, 1960s. That's how long that lasted and how deeply it was. Yes, ma'am.
Now, was this true?
I got one right behind you. Just a minute.
I understood that the militia that did that fighting here or held off the Union Army was never actually activated. It was not considered activated. My grandfather was one of them, and he applied for a pension, and his letters told me that they were never activated.
Well, I don't know. The governor issued a proclamation. What they were never done, they were never, what's the word? They never went into federal service. And that was the big difference. You had to be, the word's not mobilized, but that's what it means. You had mustered in. You had to go take the oath that you were in the service of the United States Army, and I'm sure they never did that and wouldn't have wanted to do that. And that's probably, and the federal government, of course, then just turned around and said, okay, you didn't take the oath, you don't get the pension. There was a lot of that sort of thing went on. Kentucky stayed in court with the federal government till the turn of the century, trying to get claims back against the federal government for damage in the war and supplies that Kentucky had bought to fight the war. And a good example of that is the federal government said that they would pay for weapons that the states bought for use in defense of the Union. In June of 1865, a train stopped down here, unloaded thousands of Triplet and Scott carbines, state-of-the-art, modern, breech-loading, repeating rifles. They took them up to the state arsenal and sent the bill off to Washington for thousands of dollars to pay for these things. The feds wired back, when did this train arrive? June 1865. When did the war end? April. These guns were not used in the defense of the Union. You're stuck with this bill. And this went on in the courts for years and years and years. Finally, Kentucky won. We got our claims, something over $1 million. You know what we did with it? Built a Capitol building over there. In part, that's what that money went for. So there was a lot of that, a lot of confusion over what the federal government was really liable, responsible for. Yes, ma'am. Oh, built the new Capitol?
Oh, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
What about the Home Guard in Virginia? Were they almost disrespected also?
I don't know. Virginia's a whole other ball of wax.
I don't know.
Some of my family were in the Home Guard, but they were in Virginia.
If I would expect the Home Guard in Virginia was probably the pro-Confederate militia. Once all the volunteer units went away, that'd be my guess, but I really don't know Virginia. So. And they were probably held in considerably more high regard by their
They
neighbors.
were. That's why the question, because my grandfather, I think, was in the Home Guard in Virginia.
That was a whole different world.
Okay.
Nicky, did the state of Kentucky pay Confederate pensions?
Yes. The state of Kentucky did pay the pensions to Confederate soldiers. They started when it was
Early 20th century before they did it, before they started paying them.
My grandmother's was like 1940. Maybe it was because they didn't apply until very late.
Yeah, and they kept paying them and well into the 20th century. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Would you be aware of any time in the Civil War where there was actually firing from Berry Hill to Fort Hill and vice versa?
I don't know when it ever would have happened. There was definitely some firing off of Berry Hill when the Confederates came in, or when the Union troops came in 1862 and the Confederates were down swearing in their governor and such. But I doubt they were firing at Fort Hill because I don't think the Confederate troops were garrisoned there
At that time.
Well, thank you very much, Nicky, and
Yes, sir.
thank you all for coming. And
John?
yeah,
You had on the notice, bring pictures. General John Bell Hood, one of the 8 full generals in the Confederate Army. He was my grandfather's second cousin, although I didn't know it until recent years. It was not a family tradition or anything. He was wounded at Gettysburg, lost the use of his arm at Gettysburg, lost his leg at Chattanooga, and his pride at Nashville, where he was soundly defeated by the Union forces. And then I have one for my wife. Which is what I think is a rather interesting story. This is Jenny Almeda Mitchell, Eileen's great-grandmother. Her husband was in the Union Army, was in the Battle of Richmond, and then died in Cincinnati while after the Battle of Richmond. His body was being brought home for burial in a cemetery in Nicholas County. And on the way to the cemetery, someone fired into the funeral procession, shot into the casket, and shot the horse that Jenny was riding. We've been unable to find out who was probably responsible for that. There was an old man in the family said he had known who they suspected of it, but he had forgotten. It might have been some of his family, because like so many families in Kentucky, this family was divided. But it's, to me, a dramatic story and shows how bitter the Civil War was for many Kentucky families.
Should you bring some other things also, Lynn?
No, I see some here. They're not mine.
We brought that, there's a letter from the General Hood to my grandfather. It's all that.
Well, here's General Hood, and there's the letter.
Do you want to talk about these, Alice?
I know something about them, I really don't know very much about it.
My great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison Bland, who was the son of Harrison Bland, lives in the home on Leestown since 1816. I had a son, Benjamin, and Benjamin served as a major in the assigned to the headquarters, Army of Tennessee, General Hood's division. And this is a picture of my great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison Bland. Of course, when the war was over, he returned to the home out here on Wilkinson Boulevard, which was then Leestown Road. These are excerpts from General Hood's memoirs attesting to his valor and honor. And apparently an incident occurred in 1862 where he had personally offended my great-grandfather and wrote a letter apologizing to him and signed it John B. Hood. My great-grandmother, wife of Benjamin, was the daughter of James Ware Bacon, who served as a physician at the Confederate prisoner of war hospital in Philadelphia. She served as, she wasn't educated as a nurse, but she served as a nursing assistant at that. The Bacon family was here in Frankfort, and she returned several times to visit the family and ultimately married my great-grandfather. You all have referred to Fort Hill several times throughout the talk. That was known as Blanton's Hill before October 7th, 1862, and I hope some consideration will be given to renaming it to the origin from which it came in this city, Harrison Bland. He gave it to the city many years ago.
Thank you. If I give people your telephone number in case people that are watching this on cable 10 have things that they'd like to bring to your attention regarding Frankfort and the Civil War. Nicky's with Historic Properties up at Berry Hill, and his telephone number is 564-3000. So if any of you have any pictures or stories about Frankfort and the Civil War, or Frankfort history in general that you'd like to relate to Nicky, you can reach him at Berry Hill at that telephone number. Well, again, thank you all for coming, and one more pitch for the book. If you want to read more about Frankfort history, this is a pretty good book, and it's available at Poor Richard's Bookstore on Broadway. So, thank you, and have a safe trip home.